So I'm here going to talk about Canvas Learning Mastery Gradebook. And if you recall, how I left the last time was trying to help the students to be less focused on grades, but focus on mastery learning, which is the basis of all spec grading, right? How do you move from this grades to specific things that you think the students want to get from you after the class is over? However, after you're going through all this training, even struggling to understand yourself first, trying to figure out what that means. But once you have something set up, how do you actually explain to the students? Right? Are they going to be more confused about what you're trying to do? And so how do you convince students, yes, focus on mastery learning is good, but don't worry about your A, B, or C. That's probably a hard hurdle to cross. Right? So what I try to do is with the notion of being transparent to the student, just like what I'm going to do with spec grading, is that you want to be very specific and explicit about how the students are scored. So what I try to do on the first day, as we all do, try to talk about the syllabus, how we grade. So instead of focusing on, this assignment is worth X amount of percentage, I actually spend a lot of time talking about the mastery. In my class, since the technical communications class, I talk about how important it is to have written mastery, verbal mastery, but also work as a team, and how important it is to develop this lifelong learning set of skills even beyond my class, because they're going to have to use these lifelong skills to not only for my class, but also help them succeed in the future. So if you recall, for my class in engineering, there's actually an easy start for me because we all under engineering curriculum, we all have to be accredited. So it starts with ABET accreditation. So there's a list of criteria that we all have to follow. My class of all engineering classes. Then I explain how that maps to learning outcomes, which I kind of go over with these little arrows things. And then I develop the rubrics against it. But then I also remap it to what does it all mean in the arc of their career, not just in my class, but also beyond. So I'm not trying to bring that relevance that you need to develop a growth mindset because your learning doesn't stop after getting your degree. You have to keep learning. And how do you do so is develop this grit, not learn through failure, not be afraid of feedback. And you have to give them some more self-control. Right? Or trying to get them to understand that you have to take ownership of your learning. You're not relying on me, instructor, all the time for answers. You have to be able to search things that you don't know what you know. So I'm trying to bring that out, sort of trying to make them understand focusing on mastery is much more important than grades. And I loop it back. And that's why ABET, when they go around different institutions, that's what they look for. It's not just me talking, me personally. It actually has a purpose why ABET accreditation established. All the things I talk about I want to do in the course actually also flows from ABET. Sort of trying to develop a better picture of how that applies to the real world. And then for me, I'm also very conscious that students, who's this instructor talking? Why do I need to believe in it? Right? So in my class, I integrate in my daily assignments, well, not daily assignments. Every time I lecture, I usually, not all the time, but a lot of it, I do start out with some professional insights. For my former students, a year or two out, they talk about why my class is important. Why is it relevant to their career? Not just because they want to get an A and B, or give them some advice on how to be successful in this class. And having big specific examples like the student did, we have a assignment called how do you write? They have to write a written instruction how to fold a paper airplane. It's basically explaining to somebody how to fold a paper airplane. And this former student of mine, actually wrote me back a couple of years later and say how interesting that assignment was applicable to what she's doing now as a biomedical engineer, working to write technical test protocols for the technician to conduct testing. So bring a lot of real world examples to help bring the relevance to what I teach and why is it important for them to also pay attention. And like I said, I reinforce mastery in everything, every assignment, almost every in-class discussion that I do to reinforce what are the key points that we need to master. And so it comes to now. In Canvas, we have outcomes, we have rubrics, right? And when you grade assignments, you use rubrics to grade assignments. In my perspective, rubrics should be lined up with learning outcomes. In fact, I'm lazy in a sense that when you do rubrics and you try to assign some learning outcomes, it's actually difficult to do because I want to use rubrics to score, but I want to go through another step to check another box to say, how does that apply to learning outcome? So in many ways, I came up, no, I didn't come up with it. It just worked out that way. It's a hack in a sense of why not I just built the rubrics inside learning outcomes. So with my different mastery of communication, verbal, I have specific rubrics. I know you can't see it, but when we have the slide, you can. With every mastery, there's 4 specific rubrics and how sub-rubrics specifically how I evaluate each of those mastery, the learning masteries. What I did then is I actually built that into the learning outcome. So I go to the outcome. I build a specific rubric. So there's 1, 3, 4. This is written mastery. There's 4 categories and how I actually use to assess students' writing. And each of those are named here, 1.1, 1.2, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then there's 4 subcategories for each written mastery. So with that, so I built that in outcomes. What's nice about that too is that they also keep me in check and also help the students that if the outcome is written, in this case, what are specific tasks that they're being judged on to actually reach that outcome. So when I go to rubrics, I just add rubrics. I find outcome. Type it in. And then the outcome pops up, right? Obviously, I have basically for written work, there's 16 of these. And so I would import them as my rubric. Now having rubrics, and obviously now once in the rubric section with all the written assignments, I can attach this as a way to grade it. So just like the slide I showed before, this is an example of a written work. So then when I go use the speed grader, I actually grade each of these categories with the students, and the students actually peer edit one another, and I ask them to also score based on these categories. So it's a continuous reinforcement of what mastery learning is on the top, but what are the steps, the specific criteria you need to get there? Not only they're being graded on, but they also have to be a little bit reflective when they become the peer editor, assessing other people's work. So if you do that with Canvas, is that in the gradebook, if you do mastery learning gradebook, you can a little feature you have to turn it on. You know, this is how the gradebook usually looks like, right? You have your grades and whatever your scores is. There's a feature, and some of you probably already know, is that you can turn into mastery learning. Then you don't necessarily get the scores, you get these little color boxes. What's nice that is if you look at the top, it's 1.1, 1.2. Remember, there's just the categories I have in terms of the rubrics. If I score them already, I can see at a glance what are the weak spots, right? I have all the color boxes checked: exemplary, satisfactory, passing, no, not accessible, no effort. I can see a little bit what's going on. Now, as a class, I can see what's going on, but if I want to look at, well, who is not doing as well, not mastering the skills, I can unclick those color boxes and I can see not only who, which is on the left, don't see it, that are struggling a little bit, maybe for me as an instructor, what areas that they're struggling most. Right? Maybe it's the middle section here. So it's something that I have information I can use to either emphasize that more during discussion, or bring in extra resources for them to help. Now, from the student view, I don't have a student view here, they can also understand and see their weak spots based on the color scheme. So again, I try to explain that to students as well. Especially, my class is not that big, but in a big class, trying to help individually be nearly impossible. But that counters the notion that they're, in my class, they're seniors. They need to be able to take control of their own destiny and really understand what are the weak spots and gaps and take control of how I can fill this gaps myself. So I find this tool very useful, not only for me as an instructor, but also for the students who really understand what they don't understand and fill the gaps. We're just talking about that. It's kind of funny. So all this is to reinforce the fact that this class, my class, is part of a long journey to get to the future and how to be successful in the workforce. So how did it go? I've done this. So summer, I took this class like you did. And then fall, I did a test on one of the assignments. And then winter and spring quarter were the full implementation of the entire class, my curriculum. So you see here on this chart, the yellows are before spec grading. I don't grade on a curve, the straight scale. Everybody should get A's if they get A's, or mastery, I'm sorry. And the blue is after spec grade. So you can see the difference is mostly between B+ and A-. Right? There's people that may be on the borderline that either I was more explicit about how they're graded, they'll be able to fill those gaps. I hope that's the case. But certainly one thing is always, and I think I mentioned last time, is that with spec grading, certainly whatever I do, I don't want to compromise any rigor in my class. I just want to be more explicit on what they're scored on so they can meet the challenge. There's always going to be people on this end, and that's okay. But at least they know, hopefully now, why they're at that part of the spectrum. So some feedback from my students: firm but informative grading. Peer feedback, having a second chance at group paper A is good because they can understand the weaknesses and then improve it for the next time. And because of the specific rubrics, and I'm scoring against it, they thought that there was additional detailed feedback that they appreciate, so they know how to improve.
Okay.
Thank you for that. It's extremely well organized and really logical. I really like that. You might have mentioned this before, but if you have multiple assessments that in some way, shape, or form map to a given rubric, like 1.1 or 1.2, how does that show up?
Sure.
Let's say one assignment they do an exemplary job, and then the other two they not so well. So how does that show up in the kind of mastery, the color coded scale?
So I think I understand your question. What I do for my class is maybe it's easier for a communication class. I use the same rubric. I use the same rubric for all the assignments, right? Because they have the right. So what I do when I develop my rubrics is I want to think about not developing a rubric where it's very specific to a particular assignment. And that may be difficult for math, for example. But even that, I think there's probably a middle ground where the background that if we want to help our students develop critical thinking skills, like in my class, engineers really hate it because they come to me and say, just tell me the answer. Well, I say, that's the problem. There is no right answer or wrong answer in communications, right? It's how you make the argument to make me want to believe your arguments is correct. So I try to develop a rubric where it's more critical thinking based. I want to understand how they think versus what the answer is. So that means that rubric allows me to apply the same critical thinking rubric to every assignment. So every assignment, I'm hitting those 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4. So throughout the entire quarter for every assignment, they can see the progression. Or after it's done or halfway through, they can know their weak spots are. I'm not sure that answers your question.
To some extent, I guess it's more like, what if it's inconsistent? Like it's for a specific mastery concept.
Inconsistent in terms of how I grade.
No, in terms of how they perform. Let's say, as an example, let's just say it's the paper airplane instruction. And let's say there's 3 or 4 concepts that you're looking at, and let's just say that you do 3 assignments like
Yes.
that. And then you're assessing the same one. So let's say they do awesome at one and then
Yeah.
not so great another.
So I think the missing link there, you're right. If they just see the scores of 1.1.2, they're not don't have context. So that what I grade is we actually also from peer editing as well. We're actually putting specific comments in the paper and then we score. So they can see why am I doing bad here? Of course, they may not know because they just scored, let's say 4 on the previous one.
Sure.
I always encourage students and actually ask them to go look at the feedback so you understand the context. So in my class, when I do peer editing, I'm very specific about it. And that's from experience too. In the past, I say, go peer edit. And then the quality of editing depends, very dependent. So I'm more explicit on how they should look. So I actually spend class time to look at explain how they should peer edit. So when they write comments, it has to be very specific to an area. And write it in a way that the author can do something about it. Not say this is a great paragraph. Well, there's nothing I don't know why. So maybe with a combination of scoring and the specific comments, they can see the inconsistency if they develop it. Does that make sense?
I think so. Thank you.